Okay, folks. So last week we talked about a pair of rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, who were the last of the Zugot, or at least the last of the Nasi Av Beit Din pairs, who are really significant prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. Today, we're going to kind of bridge that divide from the period of the Zugot, which is to say the Second Temple period, into Rabbinic Judaism proper. For one thing, right? We're going to be looking at beginning to look at the period of the Tanaim, which is the period of the early Rabbinic sages. And the individual that I want to focus on today to kind of start that out is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is a first-generation Tana, and pretty significant for that transition from the period of Second Temple Judaism in which the Pharisees exist as a sect of Judaism that is the ancestor of what we think of now as Rabbinic Judaism, into Rabbinic Judaism proper, which kind of, if you want to give it a beginning, the period when it really begins is after the destruction of the temple. Before I go into Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's life, what I really want to start with is some historical context, because the significance of Yochanan ben Zakkai there's a lot of pieces of halakha and a lot of teachings that are, ascribed to him, but the real core significance of him in rabbinic history has to do with more of what he did than what he taught. So to kind of rewind a little bit, the Romans had been occupying Eretz Yisrael from 63 BCE. So in other words, 63 years before the Common Era. Prior to that, for some time, there had been a period when the Romans had been fairly influential in the politics of the Hasmonean dynasty. But in 63, the Romans came in and basically and conquered in response to a dispute in the succession. Right, the queen had died, and there was some dispute over who the rightful heir should be. The Romans stepped in and kind of took over and filled that power vacuum. They determined who the king was going to be, and there continued to be an Israelite king during this period of the end of the Second Temple period. But the people who were really in charge were the Romans. During that time, the representative of the Roman government was occupied a position known as procurator, and the primary function of the procurator was to collect taxes and send them back to Rome. He was primarily a tax collector, and also, of course, there was a garrison of Roman troops there to ensure that the conquered territories remained conquered. So, because the procurator was allowed to keep any surplus taxes that he collected beyond the amount that he was supposed to, send back to Rome, taxes tended to creep up over time, and so more and more Roman rule had become more and more difficult for people to bear in the Judean territory. In addition to the growing taxes, the Romans continued to play a more and more intrusive role in Judean self-governments, particularly unpleasant to the Jewish locals was the Romans' occasional favoritism of the non-Jewish inhabitants of the land, and also the fact that the Romans started weighing in on who was appointed high priest. Particularly beginning around the start of the Common Era, Rome took it upon itself to appoint the high priest directly, and they would always select a candidate who was an ally who had collaborated with Rome, right? And so these, among other things, tended to increase the Jews' dissatisfaction with Roman rule. until around the beginning of the Common Era, a new group developed among the Jews. They were referred to as the Chanim, which literally means jealous ones, those who are impassioned. In our modern terminology, we refer to them as the Zealots. They weren't so much a sect of Judaism as they were a political party. They were heavily focused on the goal of expelling the Romans and returning Eretz Yisrael to Jewish self-rule. Their numbers kept growing in response to increasing taxes and the that were being heaped on them on the Jews by the Roman governors, until in 66 of the Common Era, Florus, who was the last procurator, stole a whole bunch of silver from the temple. And that enraged a great many Jews, and so there was a riot in Jerusalem, and they wiped out the Roman garrison. A larger force of Roman soldiers was sent in from Syria to kind of get the situation under control, but they were defeated as well. As you might expect, right, that military victory encouraged the Zealots, and a lot more Jews flocked in to join their party. And they began and they basically embarked in a full-scale revolt in the territory of Judea. At this point, Rome sent in a force of 60,000 more highly trained troops. They reconquered the Galilee, which was a major center of zealot activity. They killed or enslaved probably something like 100,000 Jews in that action alone. And then they moved on to lay siege to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, at this point, was flooded with refugees from the fighting in the Galilee, and the situation was growing more and more tense. Basically, many of the city's leaders were reluctant to support the resistance because they could sort of see the writing on the wall and understood that the revolt could not succeed in the face of Rome's superior military might. But the zealots in the city rose up and they took over the city, and they basically murdered anyone in the Jewish leadership who disagreed with them. And so from some time, that was basically how things stood in the city. For about 3 years, the Roman army was besieging the city from the outside. And on the inside, there was a bloody civil war that was being waged, where the zealots were, had seized power, and they would basically kill any, non-Jewish people that, attracted their attention, and also would kill any Jewish person who didn't appear to be sufficiently zealous and supportive of the cause. The city was fairly well provided for because despite the siege, because a group of wealthy citizens had stockpiled a great deal of food and firewood to help feed the city. But at some point, a faction of the zealots, apparently in an effort to force the people of the city to fight the Romans, set fire to the granaries and burned all of the food, thus setting off basically an artificial famine in Jerusalem. So in 70 of the Common Era, the Roman general Vespasian conquered the city and destroyed the temple. And this is the point from which historically we count the beginning of the second Judean exile, right? The first period of exile was earlier on when the Babylonians came in and conquered, but this set off the second and much, much, much longer period of exile. So all of this is significant and important because for what we're discussing today, because it really sets the scene for why Yochanan ben Zakkai is important. So I want to take a moment now and kind of rewind and focus on our rabbi for the evening, right? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is a student of the sage Hillel. I mentioned that both Hillel and Shammai had a whole bunch of students. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of Hillel's students. Somewhat hyperbolically, he is said to have been Hillel's least gifted student, having merely studied Mishnah, Gemara, Halacha, Agadah, the exegetical principles of the Torah that had been laid out by Hillel, the system of calendrical calculation, numerology, the language of the ministering angels, of the spirits, and of palm trees, parables, fables, and the Kabbalah. Reminding you, he is Hillel's least gifted student. So what the other students had been studying beyond that, I really can't tell you. In any event, he is said to have lived in various places in Eretz Yisrael in his earlier years. They say he lived in Arav, which was in the Lower Galilee, for 18 years. At some point, he supposedly went to the town of Yavna and established there a Beit Din. But after this, he moved to Jerusalem, and it was there that he was living when the Great Revolt broke out and the city was besieged by the Romans. So remember that the situation in Jerusalem is pretty dire, right? The Romans are on the outside and no one is getting through. There's a famine going on because the Zealots have burned up all of the food. And meanwhile, they're running around, slaughtering any Jews deemed insufficiently Jewish or insufficiently dedicated to the Zealots' cause, right? There's some indication, at least in some of the Talmudic stories, that the reason for the burning of the granaries was specifically because the rabbinic sages, i.e. the Pharisees, were trying to urge the Zealots not to fight the Romans. And that in response to that, the Zealots burned the grain storehouses. Whatever the truth of that, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was among the people who saw that the revolt couldn't possibly succeed. The rebel leaders had declared that no one was allowed to leave the city on pain of death. So there was no easy way for him to get out. Nevertheless, he decided that he needs to find some way to get out so as to preserve the Torah's teachings should the worst occur and the Romans conquer the city and basically slaughter everybody, right? Because most of Israel's significant scholars at this point are gathered together in Jerusalem. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sent for his nephew Abba Sikra, who was actually a leader of the Zealots. And he asked him to find some way for him, for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, to escape the city. The plan that they came up with was for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to fake his own death. He was put into a coffin, and then two of his disciples carried him out of the city for burial, because they couldn't keep bodies within the city because that would cause disease to spread. At first, it seems there was an issue. The guards wanted to stab him to make sure that he was actually dead, but the disciples managed to persuade them not to do that out of respect for the rabbi. They said, basically, what would the Roman, what a field day the Romans would have if it got word to them that you had stabbed your own rabbi, basically. So once they got him out of the city and went back in, Rabbi Yochanan got out of his coffin and he went straight to the general Vespasian. As the story goes, when he was brought before the general, he greeted him with language that was characteristic of the emperor. He addressed him basically as the equivalent of Your Majesty. And at first, Vespasian was really angry, thinking he was being mocked, and maybe worried also that people were going to hear this kind of language and kind of think that he was sort of angling to seize the throne. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai explained that he had foreseen with prophecy that Vespasian was going to be made the next emperor. He gets sort of put into prison and held for a while, but eventually it turned out to be the case that the previous emperor died and Vespasian was appointed emperor. Remember that the position of emperor in Rome is not a hereditary position. It's something that is determined by the Roman nobles. So he's appointed as the emperor, and when this happened, the newly crowned emperor Vespasian declared that he would grant Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai one request. And famously, what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai requested was, give me Yavne and its sages. In other words, he was asking the emperor for permission to set up a rabbinic academy in the town of Yavne, which is sort of in central Israel, and to basically allow him to continue teaching, allow the Torah to continue to be taught, right? So he moved to Yavne and established a rabbinic academy there. After the destruction, after the siege of Jerusalem was over and the temple had been destroyed, many of the remaining sages came to join him in Yavne, and they began teaching the oral tradition and bringing up a new generation of students. And essentially, those sages became the first generation of the Tanaim, right? The first generation of the rabbinic sages, whom we remember now primarily as the voices that contribute to what we think of as the Mishnah, right? So over time, new rabbinic centers began to pop up in Eretz Yisrael, and then later on further afield in Babylon and some other places. But all of that ultimately blossomed out of this academy that Rabbi Yochanan established for the sake of preserving the Torah. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is an interesting figure in that regard. He's often looked upon as something of a hero in the context of rabbinic Judaism. He's a major teacher. He brought up many students. He sacrificed a lot in order to preserve the tradition of rabbinic teaching. And at the same time, he was probably viewed by many Jewish people, and particularly the Zealots at the time, as a traitor, right? Because he had run. He hadn't, fought for Jerusalem. He had escaped so as to found this academy. In later generations, the rabbis would come to blame the destruction of the temple on sinat chinam, baseless hatred, such as that which motivated the Zealots to slaughter even their own people. When the rabbis are talking about the reason for the temple's destruction, that's ultimately how they come to regard it. The rabbis had no love for the Zealots. But as for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, his attitude can maybe best be seen in this anecdote from the tradition. There's a story that he and Rabbi Yehoshua were walking through the streets of Jerusalem. And when they passed the ruins of the temple, Rabbi Yehoshua began to weep, and he cried out, "Woe to us that the holy sanctuary is in ruins, the Holy of Holies, where atonement was made for the sins of Israel." Rabbi Yochanan comforted him, it says, and he said, "My son, do not weep, for we have another source of forgiveness just as good. It is acts of kindness, as the prophet Hosea said, for I desire mercy and kindness, not sacrifice." So this is maybe characteristic of the kind of person that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was, in terms of elevating kindness and compassion for other human beings as not only a core tenet of the ethical tradition of Judaism, but also as basically a replacement for the temple sacrifice. And also, I think it's indicative of what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the early generation of the early generations of Tannaitic sages really represent for our tradition, which is the determination to preserve the teaching, right? The determination to preserve the tradition of the oral Torah, and at the same time, the openness to find alternate routes, to transform and adapt Judaism to operate in a period after the destruction of the temple. Because with the destruction of the temple, right, a great deal of what earlier generations of Jews would have considered central to what it means to be Jewish was completely unavailable to the Jewish people. The temple was destroyed. Not too long after, a decree was handed down that Jews were not even allowed in Jerusalem anymore, right? And the entire people was scattered to the winds, right? Exiled into many different places and having to set up communities in lots of different places. It became necessary then for Jews to rethink what it meant to be Jewish, and also to rethink what Jewish practice was and how people were going to put it into practice. And a good deal of that involved a certain amount of creative rethinking of, in the absence of these things that we used to rely on, this is what we do instead, right? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in this story is a perfect example of that, right? No longer are we able to perform the sacrifices which we used to perform in order to receive atonement for our sins. And so instead, we have to rely on deeds of loving kindness, because that also can serve as a form of atonement, and maybe one that's just as good as the temple sacrifice used to be. Accepting, nevertheless, right, the sorrow and tragedy and sense of loss that he and all Jews of his generation must have felt for the loss of the temple. All right, so that was a lot of kind of frontal kind of spiel here, but I wanted to kind of give you a general kind of overview of who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was and why he's significant. What I kind of want to do now is just kind of open it up for thoughts and kind of exploration and questions, and kind of, just kind of make some room for some conversation. Sharon, I can't necessarily see everybody in the video, so if I don't call on you, just feel free to unmute and just say something.
Does the tradition have any sense of how long it would have taken to make the switch for this overwhelmed people to kind of move over to a concept that's based on ethical behavior rather than sacrifices?
Sure. So it's a little tricky, because the sort of primary source of these stories that we have is the rabbinic literature, which understandably is very rabbi-centric, right? For the rabbis are the center of the world. And so in all of their stories about the Second Temple period and the early Tannaitic period, they come across as being extremely important, right? And being generally listened to. However, we know that there existed several other major sects of Judaism that were floating around at the time. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus talks about three main groups: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Of those, and of course the Zealots, right, who formed sort of a fourth group that were less of a religious party and more of a political party focused on Jewish sovereignty. Of those three groups, the Sadducees were heavily based around the center of the Sadducee community were members of the priestly families. So because of that, and because they did not accept the idea of an oral Torah as such, there wasn't really a lot of room for them to continue existing after the destruction of the temple. They didn't really have a good pre-existing rationale for making adjustments in the way that Rabbinic Judaism did. And so they fairly quickly died out, it seems. The Essenes may have continued existing for quite some time. We've got, indications that groups of sort of semi-monastic, Jewish communities continued to exist for some time after the temple's destruction, but seem to have faded fairly quickly as well, in terms of, as far as being a very active, kind of force within the Jewish community. Then, of course, there was Christianity, because, right, early Christianity is itself, arising out of a Jewish framework, right? And at least for some amount of time, there continued to be a link between between the early Christian communities and Judaism as such, a link which grows increasingly tenuous over the years and eventually is severed as Christianity becomes more and more widely accepted in the Roman Empire and sort of severs its previous ties with Judaism. When it comes to the rabbis, though, right, it seems as if it was a process. At first, almost certainly, the center of Rabbinic Judaism was basically the academy, right? And it's almost certain that the local Jewish community would have looked to the academy for guidance on how to practice Judaism. As the community of rabbis grew and rabbis sort of started migrating to other places, right, the community started to grow. Certainly it seems, at least from my non-sort of academic historian kind of perspective, that by the time that we get to the end of the, period of the Tanaim, that the Jewish community in general has pretty much accepted the rabbis as the representatives of Judaism as such. There are, of course, differences between one community and another. And, the rabbis aren't the only power holders within the Jewish community, but the rabbis have grown to become an increasingly authoritative and important part of the Jewish Jewish leadership. I think the primary reason for that is that the rabbis had an answer to the question of how it is we're supposed to do Judaism now, right? Which is something that really none of the other groups of Jews really had, right? The Essenes were always kind of their own sort of little tight-knit, self-referential, kind of isolated apocalyptic group, right? Their whole strategy was to found their own little insular communities out in the wilderness and basically hunker down and wait for the apocalypse to come, right? When the apocalypse didn't come, right, that strategy slowly kind of faded away as something useful. And the Sadducees really only made sense as an ideological group when being a priest was a position with a great deal of social and ideological cachet in the Jewish people. With the destruction of the temple, that was no longer the case. And so the centrality of the priestly party kind of tended to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the rabbis, descendants of the Pharisees, had already been a widely recognized group within Second Temple Judaism. They'd been a power player within the mix of the Jewish people. And with the destruction of the Zealot party, right? The Zealots really didn't survive long because the Romans, the last group of zealots who fled who were fleeing the destruction of Jerusalem end up holding up in Masada for a couple of years before the Romans lay siege to them, and eventually they end up deciding to commit suicide / kill their wives and children, and that was the end of the zealots, right? In the end, right, the rabbis were the only ones left standing, right? They were the only ones left standing who had any kind of coherent argument as to what it meant to be Jewish. And because of that, their position on what it means to be Jewish, including this concept of the oral Torah, which was by no means universally accepted in the Second Temple period, comes to be authoritative and generally accepted in the Jewish community, because who else is there? Like, what else is there, right? So it probably grew pretty fast because they were aside from becoming a Christian, there was really not much else that you could do in terms of adopting, some kind of stance regarding
religion.
I'm sorry, what was that, B?
I think I said the word religion. I don't know if that was the correct word to say at that time. Sorry.
No, that's okay. What were you saying religion in regard to?
Well, it seems to me that, well, first of all, we have to go back to the theory of the fact that these things are all been told, not written. Is that true? But this is what I think. these are things that happened, but they were reported on, and that can change with the telling of it so many times. So this is why I question. I'm starting to question everything now, because I think that that's the way it was so early in the start of the religion, of our religion. It is.
Yeah, I think so. I think by this point, we're actually starting to get to a point where there's a lot more independent historical evidence for some of what we're seeing, right? Now, obviously, the stories that we find in the Talmud are like very much told in a way that's sort of like they're kind of a condensed folkloric picture of what happened, right? And they're told from the perspective of the rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
But in broad terms, they're talking about real historical events, right? We know that that the Romans besieged the Jerusalem, and that they conquered the city and destroyed the temple. We know that a rabbinic academy was founded in Yavne. We start at this point to have some independent verification. And also at this point, history as an academic sort of practice has started to come into existence too. And you start to see the first mention of Jewish people in the context of specifically history that's not like religious history, right? And this is where people like Josephus actually are extremely important, because while he himself is not an unambiguous figure, right? He's a Jewish person who ends up hitching his wagon to the Romans, right? Nevertheless, he's writing history about the Jews, right? And he's trying his best, it seems, to present some kind of coherent historical picture of events, right? So there are some pretty good indicators that a lot of what we're talking about here is more or less history, although obviously much of it ends up being somewhat legendary in terms of the way that it's related to us in rabbinic literature.
Were the rabbis did it go down from father to son from that group, the Pharisees? Or if a group did go out into the wilderness, like you mentioned, and the community was now in need of a rabbi or two, I don't know of how big the communities in the wildernesses were, but did they make a rabbi? Somebody would be sent to a academic center and say, we need a rabbi, send someone out? Or did they, I don't know, rabbis were teachers, so.
A good question. Where do rabbis come from during the Tannaitic period? Rabbinic culture can maybe best be understood as an academic culture, right? It's not something that is necessarily passed down from father to son, although the rabbis do regard it as a parental obligation and responsibility to ensure that one's sons are educated in Torah, right? The rabbis do consider that to be a parental obligation. But when it comes to how this material is sort of preserved and transmitted, the context within which it's preserved is not so much a familial structure as an academic structure. So rabbinic culture centers around the Beit Midrash, the house of study, of which, right, the period we're talking about right now, right, Yavne was the important one, although there quickly grow to be other ones as well, right? And the basic idea is that people who wanted to learn Torah would go to the house of study and study with the rabbinic sages, right? And they would learn the oral Torah and the written Torah, and they would learn the traditions and master them all, right? And then they would become teachers themselves. And some of those folks would hang around and be like part of the academy community, right? The Beit Midrash community. And some of them sometimes would like pick up and go to some other place, right? To serve as judges or, sort of leaders
Leader.
in other
Leader.
Jewish communities. You know, and it wasn't maybe initially the case that rabbinic authority was always recommended in that was always recognized by different Jewish communities, but you know, in the absence of anyone else exercising religious authority, right? If you've got a learned individual who knows a lot about Torah, you're going to naturally defer to that person. And so things maybe kind of spread in that way, right? But yeah, we're not talking about something where a community is like, we need a rabbi, and so they take one of their own and send them off. It's more like individuals who feel called to study, right? Or who feel like who understand that it's an important obligation to study Torah, will go and they will remove themselves to a place of Torah, right? As one rabbi in the Pirkei Avot has it, right? And they will sit at the feet of the masters and they will learn Torah from the masters until they themselves become a master, right? And they will preserve the tradition and pass it on to future students, which is why it's a big obligation in rabbinic culture to raise up many students, right? Because it's an academic culture that is transmitted through teaching and learning. And so in many respects, the teacher-disciple relationship is even more important in rabbinic culture than the father-son relationship, right? The teacher is regarded as basically being worthy of exactly as much respect as a person's father, because as they say in the tradition, it's as if you teach another person's child Torah, it's as if you gave birth to that child. It's as if you brought them into the world. Dan, I saw a hand up though. Did you have a question or something you wanted to comment?
Are we unmuted?
Unmuted, yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay. I haven't quite formulated this, but I'm just trying to imagine what the community was like in the early days after the temple. And I started thinking, well, there are still lots of commandments in the Torah that don't require a temple. And presumably there was a need to for something like the rabbis to say, what can or can't you do on Shabbat? Can you have a lamp burning, and stuff like that. And so what's missing, and I can't believe that I would find acts of tzedakah an adequate substitute for the temple, for sacrifices. So I would need something like the prayers.
Yeah.
But aside from the prayers, I mean, there were Levites, presumably there were teachers determining halacha long before that on the non-temple mitzvot. Right?
Yeah.
And,
I mean, the rabbis of the Tannaitic period very much see themselves as continuing a tradition which existed during Second Temple Judaism. I think that one way we can think about this is that this is the second time that the temple has been destroyed. This is the second time that the Jews have been expelled from their homeland, right? Which means that by this point, we've got practice. To some extent, we could there's some historical, at least some historians believe that the very existence of the written Torah as such, right, the scroll that we now have, is actually an artifact of the first exile, right? When it became necessary to write down God's laws because people were afraid that they'd forget them. Like already by this point, the Beit Knesset, the synagogue, is a social institution which exists both in Eretz Yisrael and in other Jewish communities abroad in northern Africa, like in Alexandria, and in Babylonia, right? So that also is playing a part in sort of preserving Jewish community, right? The diaspora had continued to exist throughout the Second Temple period, right? And for those communities, it probably wasn't even quite as traumatic as it was for Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, because they already knew what it meant to, it's not a completely out of context problem, a completely shocking, impossible thing for Jews to think about, like, okay, so what do we have to do? How do we do Judaism when we're not praying in the temple? But certainly it is something new for these generations of Jews, right, who had the temple and that we're relying on certain aspects of temple ritual to fulfill certain kind of key spiritual needs. And so the rabbis are instrumental in adapting those things. But yeah, you're right. It's also not just the role of the rabbis, right? The social institute, this period also sees the rise and further development of the social institution of the synagogue as a central institution in Jewish life. Mickey, I saw a hand up there. You want to say something?
Yes. Dan got me thinking about the whole idea of the Torah is what, I mean, this is of course speculation, is what we're using now, the structure of it, similar, the same, or different than what we've been talking about in Temple 1 and Temple 2 times?
So historically, it seems highly unlikely that during the period of the first temple, there was such a thing as the Torah as it currently exists today. There may have been some written documents that purported to be the Torah of God, right? The teaching of God, but almost certainly we're talking about something more limited and more kind of scattered than the 5 books of Moses as we understand them today. The Torah as such, right, in the form that we know it, is probably compiled and canonized sometime during the late period of the Babylonian exile and into the period of return and the reconstruction of the Second Temple. When the Judean exiles return out of Babylonian captivity, right, when Cyrus the Great of Persia allows them to return, right, famously, Ezra the scribe begins reading, like the people are gathered together and the Torah is read to them, right? These are events that are depicted in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. There's at least a decent amount of historical speculation that what is being read at that point, right, that would be the Torah as we now would recognize it. But that Torah, right, that a compiled document consisting of 5 books that are attributed to Moses, right, that there's a, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, probably didn't exist prior to the Babylonian exile. It probably comes into existence during the Babylonian exile as the exiles find it necessary to write down things and to compile teachings that previously there would have been no reason to write down or compile because they were preserved in an oral form by the priests, for example, or by various kind of, through various oral traditions. So yeah, certainly throughout the Second Temple period, the Torah scroll as we now understand it existed, but probably not prior to the Second Temple period.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more ahead, but what happened when, what produced the changes of like I mean, every Jewish group that I have belonged to, they put in changes of their own. And some things stuck through the ages, and some things have not. Like, of course, the slaughtering of an animal for to show various things. This isn't done anymore because it seems so barbaric to me now, but I wonder at that time probably it wasn't.
Well, no, right? The temples, the sacrifices at the temple were not discontinued because people decided that it would be, that it would be more aesthetically appealing not to do them anymore, right? No. The sacrifices were discontinued because the Romans destroyed the temple, and the Jewish people of that time viewed this as a terrible, terrible thing. There's a variety of ways in which the Torah can be, in which Jewish law, the halacha, is sort of changes over time, right? And we'll be actually exploring quite a few of those ways as we kind of proceed through these classes, right? But I think it's also important to realize that certain practices are no longer done, not because the halacha has been changed significantly, right? But rather because the conditions for enacting those laws no longer exists, right? For Orthodox Jews.
So you can only sacrifice an animal in the temple in Jerusalem. You couldn't sacrifice it in a regular synagogue or whatever they established as a communal place.
Yes, it's established. It's firmly established in Jewish law that the only place you're allowed to sacrifice.
No, Rabbi, what I was gonna say, that I think that was Eileen's voice, but
Yes, sorry.
that's what that's what the cogs were about. And Rabbi, you were talking about the Jews that lived outside of Jerusalem, and that's why, you know, those three big holidays, everybody who could would try to come to Jerusalem. And one of the big things in Jerusalem was because the temple was there. And I think the whole point is, and going back to what Dan was saying, is that we could no longer perform sacrifices because we no longer had the temple. And a lot of the sacrifices were for sin offerings. People would come to the temple in Jerusalem with whatever animals they were supposed to come with, or grains that they were supposed, because I can't, you know, I'm sure Rabbi Leah could speak about this, but I know that different sins had different sacrificial offerings. Without the temple being there, you could not do that. And maybe that's what
Okay, thank you.
Yochanan ben Zakkai was trying to do, is say, oh, if there are no more sacrifices, that maybe what we need to do is have more kindness, compassion, studying, prayers. I mean, things that we can do without having the temple anymore. Yeah. And if Dan, I understand what Dan was saying, how do you compare having the temple to kindness and compassion? But it's just, I guess, trying to have some sort of road for the Jewish people to be able to continue their lives. Exactly what Rabbi said, this is the second time we lost our temple. So that's how I see it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, like, if from the standpoint of Orthodox Judaism, and in fact, even of conservative Judaism, all the laws regarding sacrifice, right? The offering of particular sacrifices at particular times, the requirement for offering particular sacrifices in order to atone for various sins, all of these laws are still in effect. And the only reason they are not practiced today is because there is not currently standing a temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If there were a temple standing on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, then according to rabbinic law as understood in the Orthodox and possibly conservative halakhic community, it would be obligatory to offer those sacrifices. And in fact, the prayer book of Orthodox and conservative Judaism both include calls, right, prayers for the temple to be rebuilt so that sacrifices can be reinstated. It is seen as a bad thing that we are no longer able to practice the sacrifices which are commanded by the Torah. That is obviously not the position of a great number of Jews who are operating outside of the halakhic world, right? But nevertheless, right, that is a that continues to be the perspective of a great many Jews in the world today. The difference with regard to the temple versus the synagogue, right, is the synagogue is never a place of sacrifice. Since very, very ancient times, it had come to be understood that the only acceptable place to offer sacrifices was the temple. There was one temple. There could be no more temples anywhere else. And
Mm.
the synagogue arises essentially as a way for a place for Jews who are living, outside of Jerusalem to come together and pray, right? Which is a way of spiritually connecting to God, right? When you can't go to the temple, right? Nevertheless, right, it was still considered obligatory for Jews from all over the diaspora to come in and be in Jerusalem at certain times of the year for the pilgrimage festivals in order to celebrate various sacrifices and to observe the rituals, right? So the temple continued to play a role, but the synagogue also existed as a way for people to, like, a place for people to go every day, right, to pray and to engage in spiritual connection that wasn't sacrifice based. Okay, so Joe and then Sharon. You didn't have anything you want to say, Joe?
No, that was Judy. I was signaling for Judy to speak.
All right, fine.
It would be all very well to say that the sacrifices are still documented in the Orthodox and the conservative Siddurim, but at the same time, wouldn't they say, yes, but it's still not valid because we can't really know who still is in the line of priests?
I mean, this gets into the whole kind of complicated issue of Jewish eschatology, right? Jewish beliefs about the end of times, right? There's a whole lot of complex Jewish, like whole complex Jewish body of belief that's been built up over, at this point, more than 2,000 years, right? Articulating, what exactly is supposed to happen when, when the redemption does occur, right? And part of that, right, is a certain set of assumptions that when the time comes, there will be miraculous sort of revelations that will enable us to know who is going to be the high priest, like who among the currently existing priestly families scattered all throughout the world, who's going to be the high priest, right? And other stuff as well, right? That's just impossible, right? Like there's a bunch of stuff that would be impossible to do without some sort of miraculous intervention. For example, like the para aduma, right? The red heifer, right? Is a necessary component of getting the whole temple ritual kind of started back up again, because priests aren't allowed to offer up sacrifices when they are in a state of tuma, of impurity that is caused by coming into contact with a corpse. But because no one's been able to get rid of corpse impurity for thousands of years now, right? Everybody's corpse impure, right? So in order to get the whole thing started back up again, right, you would need first to have someone find a red heifer, right, a completely all red-brown cow with no markings whatsoever, and to slaughter that cow and to burn it into the ashes and to make the waters of purification so you could purify the high priest, so then maybe he could offer up a sacrifice, right? All of these things that are necessary are believed to be sort of things that will occur through sort of miraculous intervention when the time of redemption takes place, which is also incidentally, like for most of rabbinic Jewish history, that's basically the set of beliefs also about the construction of the third temple, right? Is that it would come about through miraculous means. The modern day right-wing sort of let's get rid of the Muslims and build our own third temple, right, are fairly radical and non-traditional in terms of the theology that they've constructed to feel like they are permitted to do that. The rabbis have some very nasty things to say about people who think that they can hurry up God by bringing about the end times through their own actions. They aren't very happy about that because the rabbis remembered the zealots and did not have nice things to say about them, right? Yeah, all of this is bound up in sort of a set of messianic beliefs about when the Messiah comes and the kind of miraculous things that are supposed to attend on that. Suffice it to say that until those miraculous things come to pass, and until the Messiah comes, it's essentially impossible to get the whole thing up and running again, right? Which means that, you know, those of us who aren't super excited about the reinstating of the temple sacrifices don't have a lot to worry about. Thank God. Anybody else have something they want to contribute? Or, oh, Ross.
I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering if we can get a little bit more of a flavor for, even though there's not a whole lot. I know you said he's more about, like, he's known more for what he did versus what he said, but do we have like a little blurb or something just to give us a little taste? Or can I do that on my own time?
Well, sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, I wanted to. I brought my own, like, the thing I brought as to give a taste of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the conversation between him and Rabbi Yochanan. But I mean, sorry, Rabbi Yehoshua.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to pull up some more of his teachings. I really wanted to focus on the historical aspect of him, you know, specifically. But if people are interested, I can pull up some more representative teachings of Yochanan ben Zakkai and kind of share them out. There's quite a bit of halakha that is attributed to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He is said to have immediately established, like on the founding of Yavne, the Academy at Yavne, he is said to have immediately established a number of takanot, of rabbinic decrees that were, you know, sort of kind of preserved and carried forward, right? One of which was a decree that the shofar should be blown on Shabbat when a Beit Din was meeting. You know, these are very specific pieces of halakha that are relevant to the practice of Judaism as it was being practiced in the time. But yeah, his primary historical significance is the foundation of the Academy at Yavne and the sort of kind of transformation that occurred, therefore, in the rabbinic tradition that kind of began to blossom through his activity.
So the random acts of kindness goes way back. That's nothing new.
For sure. Eileen?
So he just he like started writing things down, the rules, like started it all.
Not writing them down, because the tradition at this point is still the oral Torah. And
Okay.
This is a really important point, actually. The oral Torah at this point is still very much an oral tradition. There is still at this point a strong taboo among the early rabbis not to write down the oral the tradition.
Wow. So that's a lot of learning they had to do.
A lot of learning.
But why?
What's that?
I always want to know why they didn't want it written.
I mean,
there's some kind of rule against it that we don't know of?
No, we know of the rule. There was a definite rule against it. It was considered to be against the Torah to write down the oral teaching, right? The belief was that when God gave the Torah to Moses, that God gave a written Torah that was to be written down and an oral tradition that was to be taught from teacher to student. And that the oral tradition was not supposed to be written down. In theological terms, right, it's basically down to that, right? That the oral Torah is the oral Torah. It was given in that way and so needs to be transmitted that way. In practical terms, there's another reasoning behind it, which is that an oral tradition has ways of adjusting itself over time to the changing conditions under which people are living, right? If I'm transmitting an oral traditions can be adapted and adjusted to meet our needs of the moment in ways that something that is written down on paper simply cannot. If it's written down in those words and in those words alone. You can't change it. If it's something that's oral, that I've heard and then reproduce orally, right? That changes every time we tell.
That could be changed.
Every time we tell a story, we tell it slightly differently, right? And
yes.
because rabbinic rabbinic tradition is very much a tradition that's about adapting the Torah to meet the changing conditions under which people live, right? It was actually very important not to write down the oral tradition, because then it would be too fixed, right? The only reason this stuff eventually does get written down later on, eventually we'll get to Rabbi Judah the Prince, and who wrote down the Mishnah, right? The only reason he considered it acceptable to do so was because of all the number, he saw the various catastrophes that had happened to the Jewish people, and the fact that the Jewish community was spreading out far and wide, and was worried that the Torah would be lost, right? Because people would be too scattered and wouldn't be able to preserve it in that sort of close-knit, community of students learning it orally from their teachers. And so he wrote it down so that it could be preserved. But up until that point, around 200 of the Common Era, the entire Tannaitic period, nobody was writing down the oral tradition. It was only communicated verbally, right?
Wow.
And so if you want to imagine the early rabbinic academies, what it would have looked like is nothing like a school like we have today. It would have been a room which a whole bunch of young people were gathered around, learning from a teacher who is speaking things out loud. And they would be remembering these things and repeating them, right? And they would then be asking questions about what they had heard. And then the teacher would answer the question, or they might get into a debate about the answer to the question. And in that process, the tradition continues to grow, right? Because every new question, every new attempt to clarify, every new argument between two people who think they heard things slightly differently tends to grow the tradition a little bit more. And that's always how Rabbinic Judaism has grown and changed over the years. We say that this is the Tannaitic period. The word Tana actually refers to a person whose job it was in the academy to serve as a kind of human book, right? It was the Tana's job to remember all of the oral tradition. And anytime that someone needed to know what Rabbi so-and-so had said about such and such, they would ask the Tana, and the Tana would recite the law. That's Rabbi so-and-so such and such about the topic, right? So this was something which existed because you weren't allowed to write it down. Joe.
Oh, it's my agent. No, this might sound silly, but could it also have been for economic reasons? I mean, how much would it cost to get the materials to write these things down with each student sitting in, again, I'm going to use the word classroom, although I know you're telling me to take that picture out of my head, but there's a lot of students, and I don't know what material was used, because we use paper now. It wasn't paper. And what was used to actually write things.
Yeah, it must have been an animal skin or something.
I'm thinking maybe economically, it just wasn't possible.
I couldn't tell you. I don't know to what extent.
I don't either. I just thought of it.
I keep thinking about, we keep discovering societies isolated from the mainstream of Western world, where people are remembering the rituals, the traditions of their own people going back hundreds of years, and people have extraordinary memories. They've also said that in a small piece of this, until recently, the Jews of Yemen could recite their genealogy back hundreds of years, and that's being lost now. But that was another form of oral tradition that kept on, and apparently was remarkably accurate.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not that uncommon a thing. In Islam as well, actually, it's actually a very important part of religious learning to remember and be able to recite verses from the Quran, right? Now they're operating from there's a written text that they're then memorizing, right? But it's a similar sort of thing. these feats of memory and memorization, I think, are only so surprising and amazing to us because we're used to being cyborgs, right? We're used to sort of like outsourcing our remembering to written text, right? Which is a very useful way to free up headspace, right? Like I don't have to remember all of those details. I can open a book and be able to remember them, right? But for much of human history and in many human cultures, right, they didn't have writing, right? Or they chose not to write certain things down. And so, it just became, it's been, humans are capable of remembering quite a lot of stuff if they set their minds to it. And if one person is trained to do so.
Well, yeah, that's how people learn. I mean, people would apprentice with the tradesmen and learn a trade. They didn't study how to shoe a horse or whatever it was that they did. And also people cooked, learning from their mothers, and the recipes were just passed on over the generations. You just did it. But learning just seems very hard. Learning Torah is much harder than learning how to cook.
This continues to be the case, like long after the oral Torah gets written down, because speaking to what Judy was saying, right, for a long time, having like a written, like there wouldn't have been like a lot of written books because written books are very expensive, right? So like we think of, you walk into a synagogue, for example, right, and everybody gets their own siddur, right, and each of us is reading the prayers from our own siddur. There's got to be enough siddurim for everybody, and people get maybe a little annoyed, like we've got to share, right? But like in the Middle Ages, nobody had a siddur, or maybe the only person who had a siddur was the shliach tzibur who's standing at the front and leading the prayers. Everybody else is reciting from memory or simply nodding along to whatever the prayer leader is saying, right? Were not so easy to come by before the invention of movable print. Sharon.
Just to follow up, when you were mentioning about the Islam, even till today, if you have, and I presume this is only men, if you have memorized the entire Quran, that gives you an enormous amount of status in your particular community. I don't know if it entitles you to some particular honor, but it is considered an honor in itself if you can memorize the whole Quran.
Yeah, it's considered to be a religiously worthwhile activity in and of itself to be memorizing, right? Ross.
So I don't know a whole lot about many other cultures in depth, but I do know that many native cultures, there was a taboo even after they developed written language for many of their traditions to not be written down, especially anything regarding, spiritual practice. So that's not totally unique to Judaism. And I think that that's really, really interesting. And I think probably for a lot of the same reasons. I'm speculating on that, but I imagine that it's for the same ideals.
Yeah.
So that, so that the teaching and the learning can grow and not just be a stagnant thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the downside of it, right, such as it is, of course, is experienced there in, I think, many, indigenous communities, just as it has been by Jews, right, which is that, in the face of persecution and even genocide, right, like one of the problems with an oral tradition is you are very, very dependent on the existence of those people who preserve the tradition and pass it down. And when there are disruptions in that chain of transmission, right, someone dies, right, or lots of people die, right, are put to death, right, by their oppressors, then you're not only losing those people's lives, which of course is a horrible tragedy, right, you are also
losing their traditions.
Yes, the culture is being killed just as the people are being killed because people contain their culture, right, and transmit their culture, right, which is why, this is something that Judaism also faced during the Holocaust, right? Which is a great many people who died in the Holocaust were like great sages of Judaism, right? Many of whom had tremendous Torah that they had to, that they were preserving and they knew and that they could teach. but some of which is completely lost to us because the Nazis were intent on, the Nazis were not only destroying people, they were destroying a culture, right? And that's every genocide is both a genocide of human beings, but also of culture, right? Because humans ultimately are the containers and transmitters and transmission vectors of a culture, right? And that's how we pass it down. That's how we preserve it.
Rabbi, I'd like a little levity on something. When I made my first Seder, I was pretty young when I cooked everything for a Seder, and I served my husband's family at that time a hard cooked egg. I removed everything except the yellow part, the solid yellow part, and I put it into the soup and put the water rather, and served it that way. My husband's family didn't know what I was doing because they never saw anything like that. Well, that had been a tradition since I was 5 years old, that I remembered that this is what my grandmother did. I thought it was something religious that I had to do. I had no idea at that stage of life that it was something that she just decided she was going to do. And I thought it was something that I had to do to preserve what I thought was the way you made a Seder. And my husband just brushed it off, and he said, well, her family comes from Poland, so you know how the Polish are. And he made a silly remark like that. But I still continued to do this, almost all my life when I've made a Seder, because somehow it connects me to my grandparents again.
Exactly, right?
And
you're preserving something important, whether or not that thing was approved by some rabbi, right? It's a family tradition, and that's in and of itself a very important.
I didn't realize it was a family tradition, that it wasn't something that we were supposed to do because it was a Seder meal.
Yeah, in a way that's as precious or even more precious, because it's it's something that is like your family, right? Which means that there aren't a million of them. Yeah.
I was curious if anybody else had ever done this in our group. Put a hard cooked the yellow part of the egg that you've cooked. You put that into the water that goes around with the salt and everything.
Yes,
Does anyone else do it?
Yes, my mother and grandmother used to make that just in cold soup with egg
cold water with some salt in it, and you would dip your greenery in their pieces, and then you would eat the egg, of course, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there were other families that did this. Well, maybe they came from Poland also. My husband's family came from Romania and Russia, so they didn't know about that tradition.
All right, folks. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it there. We've already gone like 20 minutes over time, so I guess people are really into this. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here with us tonight. Like I said, this is recorded, so I'll be uploading it presently to YouTube, so people will be able to go back and review or share with anybody who may not have had a chance to get here.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very interesting.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Take care, everyone.